Welcome back, everyone. It is Michael here with Offshore Citizen, and today we're going to talk about the subject of what is money laundering. Now, most people are not in a situation where they want to do money laundering. It's obviously a crime, so not something that you should be doing, but many people are affected by money laundering rules. So basically, every single bank in the world, at least every bank that I know of, most major financial institutions are required to have some sort of anti-money laundering procedures. And you'll see something similar when you're dealing often with the real estate industry, the gold industry, the financial services, like in terms of people doing investments, etc. There's a lot of effort that goes into what we call AML, anti-money laundering. And so it's worth understanding what is money laundering and, kind of understanding from there. Plus, it's, an interesting curiosity for a lot of people. So AML stands for anti-money laundering. Money laundering, by definition, is the process of taking illegal, the proceeds of crime, right, illegally gotten gains, and making them seemingly legitimate, okay? So, that's, you take something, say somebody sold drugs, say somebody was involved in theft, say, something like this. They do that, and then they somehow make it quote-unquote clean, all right? And the process is illegal, so it's a crime, and it has been added to many other crimes. So what's happened in the world today is that a lot of cases where, somebody's been involved in tax evasion, somebody's been involved in, some sort of securities fraud, etc., what they can do is they can add money laundering as an additional charge to kind of amp up the significance of it, all right? And there's an international effort to fight money laundering. It's probably very well intentioned, and in spite of that, it has become really ridiculous and challenging for small businesses because the onus has been placed to a large extent on these large financial institutions to make sure they're taking action, and as a result, those institutions just say, hey, look, it's not worth our risk to go and get involved with this because there might be something wrong about it. So I think it's actually a really big problem in the world today. It's an example of where government is disconnected from the realities of business. But that being said, we have to deal with it as we have to deal with it. And so let's talk about it. So first of all, just to give you the scope of how big an issue this is, I did some research. Apparently the estimate is, I don't know if this is in the US, I think it's in the US, but it could be globally, that the percentage of GDP that comes from crime is about 3.6%. And of that, 2.7% of GDP is laundered. So, about 2/3 of the amount of proceeds of crime are laundered, and that equals to something like $1.6 trillion a year. Okay, so a lot of money that we're talking about going through this process. That must be global numbers because, US GDP otherwise wouldn't work. So very, very big numbers that are involved here, and as a result, it somehow stretches out to touch many, many people. And you can kind of understand how this process works. There's what they describe it as there being 3 different stages to it. And by the way, when you kind of go this, maybe we'll give you some empathy for a banker. If you have hassles dealing with a bank, for instance, say you want to do a large cash deposit or something like this, and they have to fill out a bunch of paperwork. They're asking for your documentation, etc. What's going on there, really? What's going on is they have procedures that they're required to follow, reporting that they're required to do to the governments, the central banks, etc., in order to ensure that they're not facilitating this. And to give some concept, HSBC, for helping to facilitate money laundering in Mexico, was fined, I think it was about $9 billion a few years ago. So this is a really onerous penalty to them. And as a result, they have a strong incentive to make sure that they're following the rules and not coming down on you. This being said, in spite of that, there remains tons and tons of money laundering. So let's go through the steps. So the first step is what they call placement, okay? And placement is probably most easily understood by the fact that a lot of illegal activity generates cash, right? So for instance, somebody robs a jewelry store, they turn around, they sell the jewelry, now they have cash. What do they do with that cash, right? They want to somehow make it look like legitimate income. And so placement is typically to place it into the financial system. Hence, that's why they call it that, right? And there are various different ways that this would happen, right? In some cases, they can simply work with a bank that's complicit and they can just deposit the money right in, right? And I can tell you today, in most of the world, at least in kind of Europe, Canada, US, Australia, etc., dealing with cash is an enormous nightmare and not very common anymore, right? So certainly there are some businesses that deal with it, liquor stores, taxis, restaurants. The famous one is laundromats. So, they talk about laundering your money. Why do they talk about that? Well, it kind of ties into having a laundromat, right? Lots of cash going through there. If you look back to Pablo Escobar in Colombia, he had a taxi company and he claimed that his 3 taxis were doing something like, I can't remember if it was 5 million per taxi per year or 5 million across the 3, but it was a ridiculous amount of money that made no sense, right? And so what would happen is they would somehow take this money and they would mix it in with the regular flow of income so that they can declare it, right? The declaration process is then going to sort of create the first step of legitimizing it, right? If you can say, hey, where did this money come from? It's like, oh, these were, tips for people. This is, really big in the casino industry, right? Casinos have been famous for money laundering for a very long time. So they've laundered, billions and billions of dollars. It's one of the reasons why Macau was such a big thing, was because of all the money laundering that was going through there. All right, so they do that, you're able to take this money, it's brought in as regular business income, so you can say, okay, great, where did it come from? Here's where it came from, right? Because source of funds is a really important thing. This leads to the next step, which is called layering, okay? So layering is where you somehow confuse where the money came from to where it goes to, all right? And so one of the ways that this might happen is that you may then buy something. There's going to be a series of financial transactions which are going to put various degrees of complexity between where it started and where it ended. So let's use an example. Say you had a restaurant, the restaurant takes in cash, right? Now they want to kind of bring in more cash than is actually being brought in. So, they're going to say that they had a lot more sales than they did. Obviously they didn't, right? But, who can tell? It's hard to account for it, right? So that's the placement process. Then they may do some transactions. So maybe they say, okay, well, we are now going to go and we're going to buy some property, okay? We're going to buy some artwork for the walls in here. We're going to, do whatever with it, right? And there's any number of transactions they could do at this point in time to create a layer, which is creating a buffer from, in order for the money to be safe for them, it needs to be farther away from here. Because if you just think about it, if you have this restaurant and the restaurant makes all this money and they say, oh, this restaurant's laundering money, what are they going to do? Well, they can go and take the assets of that restaurant, right? But if you can go and create all these steps, well, now it's really hard. So layering is going to take place. So they say, okay, I'm going to buy some art. Very common to launder money through artwork, right? Art, jewelry, bags, property, a ton of, it's part of the reason why there's been such a property boom in certain of these environments has been because there's been a lot of money wanting to come out of countries like China, Russia, etc., and they're essentially laundering their money by doing these transactions, purchasing real estate. Okay, so that's another thing. What comes after that? That's integration. Okay, so integration is the third part, and this is where now that they've taken it through and the money is quote unquote clean, now they can say, okay, now we can spend it as normal. So they go and they put it into the system, they do some transactions. Probably those transactions are going to separate it from the people who did the first part for them anyway, right? So they're going to say, okay, step one, the money comes in, say that's one party, they're paying them a certain percentage, right? So they say, okay, great, if you bring in our cash, I don't know, they're bringing in $1 million a month of cash into this restaurant, series of restaurants, laundromats, whatever it is, in comes the cash. They say, okay, now what's going to happen? You're going to go and purchase something. That purchase is going to be legitimate, right? The thing that's purchased is going to be sold, and maybe who they're selling it to, maybe the purchase ended up making a transfer of the money, right, from one party to another. So they bought something for cheap and sold, on the other side, and then, okay, now the party on the other side can now take the money and they can go and spend it. And if everyone ever asks where'd that money come from, you say, oh, I sold this stuff. I'm selling this artwork. And you can see there how, hey, what's the value of art? Well, it's very nebulous, right? Who knows what the value of art is? It's totally up to the buyer. So you can get this fluctuating price. So that's pretty much the stages of money laundering. It's something that you want to stay away from in terms of, it's very negative consequence. But it also, I think why it's especially worthwhile to understand is to understand what types of activities are likely to make a bank suspicious, even though you're running a normal operation, okay? And so this is the last part that we'll kind of finish with, is, for instance, banks don't like when you send a wire transfer payment for services. Why? Well, because the value, they don't know that those services actually took place, and they don't really know the real value of those services, right? This is a nebulous thing. How much was it worth? Who knows, right? And so that transaction has a lot of fuzziness to it. So it would be very common to launder money or to do some sort of an illicit transaction by making up, oh, we're doing some services. So this is where the more that you can provide that validates, hey, look, I'm doing a real business, the less issues you're going to have with a bank, right? So, hey, I have a real office. You can see my office. Hey, I have staff. Hey, we have computers. Hey, here's the output that we have. Here's the bidding process. Here's our competitors. Here's our websites. Like, everything is very legitimate. Now, of course, what the banks have to be aware of is the guys who are doing it illegally, they're going to try and make themselves look legal, right? So this is this kind of constant chicken and egg thing. And the truth is, I don't think that banks actually care that much. I think it's that the financial authorities care, and they're simply putting the pressure on the banks. And like I said, that's created a massive problem. In my opinion, that should not really be the role of banks. I think it's creating a lot of issues for innovation in the world, and we'll maybe talk about that in some future videos. But anyway, that's an explanation. It's quite crazy, and if you've got some questions about it, write some comment in the comments. You've probably seen videos like shows like Breaking Bad where they are laundering all this money, etc. So it's popular right now, so I figured I'd make a video on it. Like the video here, share it with your friends, comment, go and subscribe. If you have questions about anything to do with international structuring, international tax planning, asset protection, banking, citizenships, residencies, please reach out to us. You can visit www.offshorecitizen.net or www.offshorecapitalist.com. You can book a call, and I will see you guys on the next video.